Good up.
This is channel 253. Beep, boop, boop.
On this episode of the Grit and Grain podcast.
Most people attribute the creation of film noir, detective noir, and eventually film noir, pretty much from Dashiell Hammett. And his great masterpiece has a centerpiece in it, which is a story set in Tacoma during Prohibition. So there's a case to be made that the origins of that noir view of American cities in that time is grounded in Tacoma and in Hammett's short stay here.
Did you know Channel 253 is member supported? I'm producer Doug Mackey, and I hope you will show your support by going to channel253.com/membership and join. Thank you.
Welcome to the Grit and Grain podcast, where we explore and celebrate the craft beer industry, community, and history in Tacoma, Washington, and surrounding Pacific Northwest areas. Thank you so much for hanging out. Let's get to it. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Grit and Grain podcast, coming to you guys from the historic Parkway Tavern in Tacoma, Washington.
Fuck yeah!
Woo! Woo! That was sincere. I just have had a weird day. My name's Matt McLaren. I'm here, of course, with Ron Swarner.
Well, hello.
How's it going?
Well, I have a pro tip. If you go to the Great American Beer Festival in downtown Denver, don't wait until you drink 101-ounce cups or glasses full of beer before you decide to do the silent disco in hiking boots, because you'll blow out your knee.
Is that what happened to you?
That's exactly what happened to me.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I started pogoing around and it went bad.
Is it still bad?
It is.
I'm sorry.
Disco and hiking boots is just
Wasn't my plan. But,
sounds like a rolled ankle.
you know,
just
the
waiting to
boots are the
happen.
plan, but not the dancing. So. Yeah.
And as some of you guys might have noticed, we took an actual week off last week. Which we have never done. But it came with some changes. One of which is a new person sitting behind the mic. So our new sort of third person is Bethany Carlson. How's it going?
Ooh, hello. Hi.
For anybody who doesn't know, which would be most of you, because it's like 9 people, I think, who know. But Sean is bartending now down at the E9 Brewery, which if you've been listening to this, you know that's where he came from. So he's back home in a lot of ways, doing his thing down there, but his schedule conflicts with our normal recording time. Doesn't mean he's never going to be back, but it does mean that we were happy to bring in somebody else who can bring some brewing expertise, and Bethany absolutely does that. She's going to be hanging for a while. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome.
Thank you.
How's your day going?
Pretty good.
Good.
Pretty good. Yes, happy to be out of the house and kid-free.
Sweet. I hope you came prepped with fuck-up stories where you almost died.
Yeah, lots.
Because that's what Sean brings to the table. Every week somehow.
Yeah.
Sweet. So that's the news. We're going to talk to Bethany a bit more and get Ron's GABF recap on the next episode. But for this week, we are going to extend our fantastic Tacoma history lesson with Mr. Michael Sullivan one more time. So this is going to be part 2 with this amazing guest, Michael Sullivan. Thanks for coming back.
Right? You sure you don't want to talk to Bethany? Are you positive?
We will next time. We were just enthralled by the entire episode last week, and I have listened to it since then, and I still was just like, this was amazing. And I was also disappointed that we left off in the middle of Prohibition before even talking about some of the most important Tacoma beer history things that people are now talking about again. So hopefully we can just pick up where we left off.
Great.
So the last thing that we heard was 2 Italian guys beefing over contraband during Prohibition. Tacoma didn't really need to stop making beer necessarily because of how they interpreted the language of the Prohibition laws, and then what else? Oh yeah, bootlegging wasn't not bootlegging, but importing from Canada wasn't really taking place for beer either, because we mostly just had it being produced here anyway. But I feel like that's kind of where we left off. So we didn't get to Heidelberg, and we didn't get to all kinds of other stuff. But yeah, if you want to take it away.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Okay, so when last we left,
Yes.
everybody was in a dark, gloomy place, right? It
That
was
is right.
the middle of Prohibition. In the shadows, in the noirish world we were in, the bootleggers and a few people were still making a living. And actually, by the time we get to like the late 20s, there are starting some of the breweries that are still around. Columbia is the big one.
Yep.
Is the big brewery, which is hanging on. They're making Colo, which is a near beer, under
Colo?
0.5% alcohol.
Yep.
And then they're making soft drinks, Orange Kissed, and various kinds of soft drinks and stuff. And they're still making beer.
Oh yeah.
But it's beer for private customers,
Sure.
and you
Going
know,
out
I
the
mean,
back door.
there were arrangements going
Yeah.
on. But what was also happening was everybody knew that Prohibition wasn't going to be around much longer. It was proving to be a disaster for a million different reasons,
Mhm.
not the least of which that it really opened the door for a lot of illegal activity in a whole realm of areas of adult entertainment
Sure.
that just weren't working out. And
Sure.
organized crime was kind of not just, you know, a problem in Chicago. It was like a problem in Tacoma,
Sure.
and Seattle, and everywhere else. So
I do appreciate that everybody was like, if we're going to break the law, we might as well just go all the way. Like, we might as
Yeah.
well do all the illegal things.
well, and some of the people who were of a criminal mind, well, this is too harsh. Some of them, though, well, Murray Morgan once said that, made the statement that Tacoma has made a lot of mistakes and reelected most of them.
Jesus.
So to some degree, we had people that were on the city council and working in local government who were more than happy to have beer continue to be sold.
Oh, sure.
And to not only get free beer out of the deal, but I'll probably get a little pay on
Little
the
slice,
payola on
yeah.
the side too. So all that was going on. We didn't have a dramatic drop in the number of taverns, you know, so that's kind of evidence what was happening. But by the late 1920s, people were starting to position to get out of Prohibition. And this is where we start to have actually a lot of the big post-war breweries were started by Canadians because they had continued to make, I mean, Emile Sick, who starts, you know, Rainier Brewery and eventually merges with Seattle Brewery in Georgetown, is a Canadian. I mean, well, he was born in Tacoma, interestingly enough.
Oh.
But his family were in the brewery business in Canada until Prohibition ended, and then they moved down here. And eventually, going way ahead into the future, Carling out of Canada will buy Columbia, will buy Heidelberg, and that will be the end, you know, of that. But that's jumping way ahead.
Sure.
So the Canadians are kind of watching over beer, and a little bit of the Canadian style is starting to get here too, in terms of the taste of the beer that's going to be made again. And we're getting a little bit away from the traditional German brews that were made by ethnic immigrant brewmasters who were bringing their recipes and their style and their taste here. And we're starting to get, this is unfair to the Canadians, but the Canadians had a more standard, I don't know, tasteless beer.
Sure.
You know, I mean, it was,
blame Canada.
yeah, I mean, it was just what was popular up there, you know, and what was the easiest to make that was starting to come down here too.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
I'm sure it was a gold rush for Canadian beer during American Prohibition, so they just had to be pumping stuff out as quick as possible.
yeah, and a lot of the beer people, we developed a taste in Washington and along the border for Canadian beer because you could get Canadian beer.
Totally.
And the borders aren't like they are today, you know, post 9/11. In those days, you know, you could walk across the border, so it was no big deal. You could drive your truck across the border, so there was beer coming in that way too. So I just have to mention during the dark days of Prohibition, a character whose name begins to be well known, the Tacoma character in the whole bootlegger realm, is a guy named Peter Marinoff, who is basically just making a living, bringing beer in. And he's a pretty inventive guy. He developed this little fleet. He had like 6 or 8 of these high-powered boats. And he was bootlegging not so much beer as hard liquor, and they were going out and meeting Canadian ships and then bringing it in, and that was kind of his racket, was in the boat business. But in the early 1930s, he knew that Prohibition was coming, and so he bought a brewery in Walla Walla, and then he began to angle to build a brewery here in Tacoma to open right away. So he opened that brewery here in Tacoma, Marinoff, and started making near beer, knowing that he was going to flip over. This is like, we don't get to start having beer until early 32. So in 31, he's already got a brewery up and going, but he's making near beer and soft drinks. But he knows he's going to flip over and do that. The other big guys are Columbia, who are making really a lot of near beer. Maybe they had the most popular brand of near beer during Prohibition locally. Their Colo was a really well-known brand that people who still had a taste for beer. So they were all positioned to get ready to open up breweries,
legitimate breweries.
And those and the big difference was pre-Prohibition. There were a number of smaller breweries in Tacoma. Variously, there's 5 and 6 breweries. 1,800, 2,000 people working in the breweries. They scale way back. Most of the breweries, Bethany Pacific goes out of business pretty much with Prohibition. And Columbia, then they hold on. And they're a pretty big operation. But then starting in 33, when we start to have beer, the breweries come on big. And Columbia's ahead of everybody. I mean, Columbia's ahead of Emil Sick and Leopold Schmidt, who's doing Olympia and Bellingham and Port Townsend. They're all slow to kind of get going, whereas and those eventually would be the big guys here locally in beer. It's going to be Columbia, Heidelberg. It's going to be Rainier in Seattle, and it's going to be Olympia out of Olympia and Bellingham. Those are going to be the 3 big guys. And you guys know this. I mean, after Prohibition, the small breweries all pretty much go by the wayside. They just can't muster the finances and the real estate to be able to get into the business and be competing again.
Right.
So,
Michael, what was the speakeasy scene in this town during Prohibition?
Well, it was kind of speakeasy, but mainly it was just the bars stayed open because they served food, and so the barman would just, or the bartender would just
be a chef now.
He knew which tap, depending on what you wanted. So we didn't have. We definitely had a few speakeasies, but not. Not like. It wasn't.
Chicago.
It wasn't Chicago.
Yeah, it wasn't Chicago. We had, our houses of prostitution were kind of that was the illegal, dark door, kind of with the hats, and all that.
Was that
stuff.
where Alfred's was doing business down there?
Alfred's that area was one of them. Peter Sandberg down below where the Schoenfeld's built, 15th, the Pacific, everything down in that area. Opera Alley, kind of up behind, but if you walk down past the Rialto down the alley, that was where Amanda Truelove's business was. I loved Amanda. She was great. And she brought down the big, that's a whole other story.
You remember, Mr.
You were there?
But when the authorities finally got on to the crooked police department, it was Amanda, who was a 350-pound African-American woman. And she she got in front of the microphone and told the truth. So
Wow.
another time, guys. we'll
Yeah,
tell you that story. Great,
Part
yeah.
3, baby.
But anyway,
So
but a juicy story is coming right now in Tacoma. The beer wars are about to start. And this is a big deal, you guys. Statewide, it's a big deal, but the battleground largely starts to be in Tacoma. Marinoff goes legit and opens his brewery down at 26th and Pacific, kind of roughly off, kind of across from where Brown and Haley is. You know where the little sales shop is? Right across the street from that. It's a vacant lot now, but there used to be a brewery. It was a meat packing plant, and he turned it into a brewery.
Oh,
but it
nice.
was like 5-story. It was a pretty big operation.
Wow.
So anyway, Marinoff started his business selling beer, and then Columbia opens, and they start really cranking out a lot of beer at the same time. At exactly that time, one of the big issues, aside from Prohibition, in terms of just social issues going on, was around organized labor. And Tacoma was a labor town. Longshoremen, people working in various industries were all unionized in Tacoma. And in 32 and 33, with the breweries opening up, a major issue came up. The beer was starting to go from being delivered in kegs to taverns and shipped by railroad to being carried by trucks, starting to be delivered by trucks to taverns and customers. Also, all the breweries opening up were setting up bottling plants, and they were starting to retail beer in bottles. Big bottles, some of them were like growlers today. I mean, 24-ounce big take-home bottles.
Those big old Heidelberg.
Yeah.
Big fat.
Yeah, and then of
bottles.
course, eventually Heidelberg would be the first to have canned beer too. But all that stuff had to be transported. And what happens is the breweries open up. There was a union, a brewery workers union, which were the unionized workers that had been before the war, and then before Prohibition, and then after Prohibition. So the union set up, and all of the workers, the guys making the beer, the people making the beer inside, were all members of the Brewers Union, Brewery Workers Union.
Yeah.
A guy named Dave Beck, who would go on, famous guy, lived to be 99, started the Teamsters Union. I mean, powerful guy, amazing character. He would achieve two things of great notoriety. He would join the Board of Regents at the University of Washington, and he would do hard time in federal prison at McNeil Island.
Whoa.
So cool
Quite
guy.
the spectrum of achievement.
But anyway, such were the proclivities of organized labor in those days. So anyway, but he was head of the. But he was head of the. He was head of the Teamsters, and he really wanted the delivery truck drivers for all the breweries to be Teamsters.
Yeah.
The Brewery Workers Union wanted the truck drivers to be in the brewery union, and that's where the trouble started. We had vicious battles between union members over that issue, and it became a major test of Dave Beck's influence and power to be able to get control of the breweries. He made progress, and Columbia pretty well went along. But Martinoff wouldn't do it. He had his whole staff were Brewery Workers Union, and all the truck drivers joined that union. And the Teamsters wouldn't have it. And Martinoff's people, he hired burly big guys to patrol the brewery. They had windows broken. And then finally in May of 1934, down at Pacific and 26, the combatants from both sides, and actually later that year, there would be even been a bigger battle. But the battle there was the Martinoff trucks were coming out. Teamsters pelted the trucks with rocks, and sticks, broke the windows.
Jeez.
Truck drivers inside had guns.
Oh man.
Started shooting. One of the Teamster protesters took a bullet in the forehead, killed him on the site. So it was, and Martinoff was just the dark villain as far as Teamsters Union went.
Sure.
So that made it impossible for the brewery to stay in business. So the second big brewery, and he had several really popular brands. Weirdly, he steps out. His life was threatened. He knew he was in trouble, and so he left the brewery. The union, the Brewery Workers Union, bought the brewery. Both Martinoff here and the brewery he had in Walla Walla.
Interesting.
And so every other brewery in the state was pretty much controlled by the Teamsters, but those two. And just another weird footnote, later on that summer, we have a general strike on the waterfront here, and maybe you've seen footage of this film, but the it's organized on a day that all of the workers from the waterfront would protest by walking over the Morgan Bridge and coming to the downtown. And as they were coming over the bridge, the governor and the officials with the city brought in the National Guard, who showed up with bayonets fixed and trucks full of munitions and everything. And there was a tear gas war at 11th and A Street. The two main newspapers were both in the Perkins building on that corner.
Yep.
So we have movie film, we have photographs. I've written about this, and a lot of the photos are on my blog. But this was it made WTO in Seattle look puny by comparison. I mean, it was a big battle. But anyway, the shooting at the brewery preceded that. It pretty well broke. The Teamsters just really were going to break the brewery. The brewery union bought the brewery, but they couldn't operate it. It was, the Teamsters just shut them down.
That's crazy.
Took all the air out of the trucks. They had to drill their own well to be able to get water because they couldn't get municipal water because the unions bought it. Was just a big hot
Holy
mess.
cow.
So anyway, but anyway, in the end, that brewery ends up hanging on a little bit. The union doesn't make a go of it. They sell it. It becomes the Pioneer Brewery. And these guys, you got to read about Pioneer Brewery because this is wacko brewery stuff. It's great. They started making all these products that were like, there's no way to, it's too bad you can't carry Taste Through Time because it would be great to be able to get a sense of what they were making. So they made the big red one, which was tomato juice and beer in a can. They made their own version of Dunkel, which, from what I understand, from what I hear, it was it would take paint off of when you spill it. It was not. But anyway, they also kept the Marinoff brand going. They had a couple of brands. They held on for a while, but eventually.
Were they making smoothie sours?
Damn it. Beat me to it, Ron. That tomato and beer was the first one.
How does
I think it gets scary when they stop having a brewmaster and they have a chemist. I'm seeing a guy in a white coat,
How does Camp Lewis come into play in all this?
Well, which is now by the Depression, it's Fort Lewis.
Okay.
And that is a whole other story about how it almost collapsed. I mean, it was neglected, and then they finally got back to building it. Of course, that's the big customer base for and they're buying beer in bulk. They buy keg beer from Columbia, and they had a contract with Columbia.
So the master sergeants were restricting them to the base. They were allowed to go off and drink.
Yes. Cool. You must have a relative. Just want to make sure he was doing
good, man.
Anyway, when the beer wars ended, then for you guys who are experts and have a palate for the varieties in beers, this would be this would be darker than Prohibition because they're making a modified, very light Pilsner, I guess. If you know, the Volstead Act, which created Prohibition, was first broken down by a law which said that they argued that anything under 3.2 alcohol ABV was not intoxicating.
Mm-hmm.
So the first beers came out and they were under that 3.2. And then a lot of them started to make other products, like Columbia made an ale, Rainier famously made Rainier ale.
Mm-hmm.
So they started to make ales, and that was their higher alcohol. But they kind of stayed in a rut as far as making pretty bland Pilsner type beer under 3.2 that just about everybody made.
Yeah.
And notoriously, Columbia had Heidelberg, and then I can't remember what they had, like 101, or there was some brand that was their ultra cheap beer.
Yep.
And that it was just the labels that were different. It wasn't any big. And coming out of the war, you're right. That's a great question. That the Depression, the World War II brought the country and the economy out of the Depression. It also brought beer making out of this sort of, in Washington State anyway, out of the troubles, the labor struggles and all that stuff. Okay. And it thinned out the crowd. And it really left us with a handful of brewers around the state that were all producing pretty much the same beer in really big volume. And this will be the time that we're on a ramp up here to where Heidelberg is going to be the biggest brewer by the 1950s. Heidelberg's making more beer than anybody else in the state. We're talking about 750,000 barrels a year. So approaching, 750,000 barrels of beer a year.
That's an insane amount of beer.
Yeah,
so much.
Yeah.
It's kind of a good thing and a bad thing to think about.
Yeah.
It's kind of like really good having all that beer, and then bad.
There's only a handful of breweries
crap beer
that do that now.
Anyway.
Yeah.
You could probably count on two hands how many breweries make more beer than that now, which is crazy.
Yeah.
I can't believe it again, but it is already a quick break time. When we come back, though, you teased us with a story of how a particular literary trend was possibly started in Tacoma during Prohibition. And I'm curious if we can talk about that when we come back.
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, stick around. We'll be right back.
Hello, this is producer Doug Mackey, co-founder of Channel 253. The worst earthquake I've ever been in was the 2001 Nisqually quake. What I remember most about that day was watching the building shake around me and watching everyone dive for cover around me. I'll never forget that experience. But it's been more than 20 years since then, and we all need to build muscle memory so that in the next earthquake, we don't panic and run out the door or something and get hit by falling debris. So do it for real with the Great Washington Shakeout on October 19th at 10:19 a.m. Plan ahead. Will your drill be at home, work, or elsewhere? Wherever you are, everyone in the state is encouraged to take a minute to drop, cover, and hold on, just like you would in a real earthquake. Again, the shakeout is scheduled for 10:19 a.m. on October 19th. Got that? 10:19 on 10:19. Easy to remember. You can learn more and get earthquake preparedness tips at shakeout.org/Washington. Thanks to the Great Washington Shakeout for this important public service.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for hanging out during the break. As always, skip to Michael Sullivan. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Doug is wonderful. We love him.
You might want to say something about the sound quality. I want to mention that.
If we sound different, it's because our producer MacGyvered a thing during a technical difficulty, but I have the feeling it's going to be fine because I have faith in it.
Paperclip will work.
And if not, we just end up sitting here having a beer, listening to these fantastic stories, and that is not the worst way to spend an afternoon either. So we're fine. Bethany, what are you drinking? I didn't ask you at the beginning.
I have the Holy Mountain Oat Pale. It's very citrusy and awesome.
It looks delicious. It's beautiful.
It's like a pillow.
I know.
A pillow
We didn't ask at the
for my
beginning,
tongue.
Okay, guys.
but what? Are we just having a beer now?
No, I'm managing to record both ways. So just keep going.
Okay, sweet. I didn't ask at the beginning, but Mr. Sullivan had a Heidelberg, which I definitely should have gotten during
Yeah, I started with a Heidelberg.
I should have gotten the Heidelberg during the break because we're going to get to that. Ron, what am I drinking?
You're drinking the Block 15 Flicker and the Russian River Funky Fooder.
How do you live with this? So charming. I've never done anything with that.
How did she live in the Heidelberg? That's the question.
Oh,
she did.
That is true. That is true. Phaedra, what's Doug drinking?
Doug is drinking the Cornada.
Not enough.
The collab with Fort George and Fremont. That's delicious.
Fort George and Fremont? Rubens?
Fort George and
Fremont.
Fremont.
That's probably it.
Yeah, it's a blend.
Probably. Yeah.
Don't question fate.
Big smash.
So yeah, before the break,
Love you too.
like we were saying, we got a bit of a tease of a literary trend, particular literary trend that I'm quite fond of myself, actually, that may have started in Tacoma. And so I'm hoping that you'll tell that story real quick on the mic before we get out of Prohibition too hard.
Yep, I'll make this will be a really short version. And to get the long version, I've written about this a lot on my blog, which is TacomaHistory.live, so you can read about this. But anyway, in 1921, we're into Prohibition 4 or 5 years in Tacoma. A young guy who had been working as a Pinkerton detective in the copper mines and in the labor disputes in Montana, in Butte and Anaconda, a guy named Sam Hammett came here. He had gotten tuberculosis, was a smoker, and so he arrived here with pretty bad case of tuberculosis, got off the train, dark, rainy night at Union Station, weighing about 100 pounds, 6 foot tall. So he came for the U.S. Health Hospital, which was up where the Puyallup tribal headquarters are now, kind of to the east of McKinley Hill, and was there. He had been in the First World War, so he was there to recover. He landed in the middle of Tacoma in the middle of a really, really dark time. The city was just violence and prohibition, mood of things.
Still gray and rainy everywhere.
Yeah,
Yep.
was here, winter time, and but he started to make note of just the surroundings, the mise-en-scene, the surroundings of the area, and was here for that winter and into the following spring, and then eventually, in fact, he married his nurse here in Tacoma. They moved to San Francisco, and he began writing and as a writer, and he took that dark, rainy kind of thing and blended it into detective stories that he began to write. He used his middle name, which was Daschle, and by 1925, he wrote probably his masterpiece, The Maltese Falcon.
Yes.
In the movie, the chapter on Tacoma is not included, but if you read the book, there's what's called the Flitcraft Parable, which is a story about a guy in Tacoma standing on the corner. The Washington building we have today had, as part of the dark corruption, had stopped work because the bank president had used all the investor money to be able to build a building. The whole thing stopped, and the building was half finished, and a beam one day just fell off the tower, came down, and in the story almost killed the guy. So that existential story in there and his creation of this city, this dark, rainy city, got worked into the novel. It was carried over from that chapter into the rest of the novel. Hammett is pretty much assigned, most people attribute the creation of film noir, of noir, detective noir, and eventually film noir, pretty much from Dashiell Hammett. And his great masterpiece has a centerpiece in it, which is a story set in Tacoma during Prohibition. So there's a case to be made that the origins of that noir view of American cities in that time is grounded in Tacoma and in Hammett's short stay here. So
it's incredible.
Good job,
Tacoma.
we
Way to be a big
digress.
bummer. But that's amazing. That's like such a crazy thing. I had never heard that until you said it, and I am like blown away by that.
Well, you were just asking about what was it like in the bars and stuff in Tacoma and during Prohibition, and I always tell people, man, pick up some Dashiell Hammett short stories because he's so detailed in the way he describes the city and just the mood and everything, and you know that idea of a northern city with lots of rain and darkness and the pools of light coming off of light fixtures onto a rain-slick street, all that stuff. That's the answer to your question about what was it like in the bars in Tacoma during Prohibition.
That entire vibe is just...
Well, he's also struggling with tuberculosis, so he's not having a great time with life anyways.
Yeah,
and
just,
also writing.
Everything's a little darker outside.
Well, and he was a drinker and a smoker all his life, lived a relatively short life as an artist and a writer, and so his time in Tacoma, he spent a lot of time in the dark corners of the city in that time, and you know, it created that invention, that literary invention of noir. So cool. Yeah. But back to beer.
Back to beer. That is a fantastic story, though.
That is.
Like blown away by that. But yeah, back to beer.
Back to beer. Well, anyway, we kind of came out of the Second World War, and what a good question about just the influence of the military base here, because during the Second World War, that probably was one of the main factors that drove Columbia Heidelberg, alt Heidelberg brand, to be the biggest brewery in the state, was because of the consumption of soldiers and the workers, and then the wartime workers. Emil Sick would buy the Rainier Brewery. Well, he starts the Rainier Brewery, but he would end up buying Seattle Brewery, and Georgetown merged the two, and coming out of the war, and that builds a pretty big second brewery in South Seattle. They're kind of there. But you know, after the war, the growth in Columbia, there's lots of money available, lots of investors coming in. Leopold Schmidt was pretty much a single owner, and so his growth was limited to his capacity pretty much. So he couldn't grow too big. Wasn't Jeff Bezos, you know? So Emil Sick was Emil Sick was kind of the same way, a pretty close blend of investors. So it was Heimek was a family that were also owned several breweries around the state, but really nobody was quite as geared up as Columbia was to really ramp into it. So they pretty well grew from being on C Street, between 21st and 23rd on C Street. They just exploded. They took out the wood buildings, put all new concrete buildings in. They had 3 lines of beer going. Man. They built a bottling plant on the other side of the Prairie Line. So when you walk down the Prairie Line today, where Seven Seas is today, that was the old bottling plant for Heidelberg. They were continued to ship out by rail and by fleets of trucks that went out. And the other great thing about Heidelberg, everybody has a preference about this. Marinoff actually went to war with Leopold Schmidt over It's the Water and some of the trademarking. And eventually Schmidt then would end up with all the marketing around Olympia beer.
Yep.
It's the Water, you know,
which a lot of folks will recognize from the brand.
Schmidt actually built the Olympus Hotel here in Tacoma. And at one time, that lettering that's on Olympia beer was, right in the middle of the street down there.
Yeah.
But he kind of got driven out. But that was the marketing there. Rainier had their own marketing style, which they promoted with sports and stuff. But the best marketing, the best advertising, the biggest budget was definitely Heidelberg, Columbia Heidelberg. They spent tons of money on marketing. And I was talking to Spencer at the Northwest Room. One of the admin from the 1950s left the Northwest Room, all of his advertising mock-ups, slides, everything from the advertising of that era. So they have a spectacular collection. And of course, a lot of people that collect Brewiana recognize all of the Heidelberg stuff.
Sure.
But Heidelberg early on borrowed this idea of the student prints. And it's because there was this kind of bad play that got picked up by a composer who wrote an operetta. A guy named Sigmund Romberg wrote this operetta during Prohibition called The Student Prince.
Yeah.
And famously, the big rousing song in the middle of that operetta is called Drink. And it's just this song about these guys standing around with these big mugs singing drink, 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 in this kind of German song.
Drink, drink, let the toast start. May young hearts never part. Drink, drink, drink.
With the singing voice of Mario Lanza giving new thrill to the memorable love songs, MGM introduces a new romantic personality, Edmund Purdom, as the student print.
But and it was kind of a underground hit during Prohibition because it kind of mocked Prohibition in general. So anyway, they picked up the student prince, which was, and that whole drama was set. It's obviously a prince who goes to a college in Heidelberg. And, he's kind of trying to conceal the fact that he's royalty. Sure. And, of course, he falls in love with the brewmaster's daughter and all. But anyway, the student prince becomes this sort of, it becomes this sort of, it's this logo of this guy with a mug in his hand, kind of protesting Prohibition was the way it originally started, but then they held on to that as an advertising ploy. So, and they, originally it was called Alt Heidelberg, Old Heidelberg, which was, ye olde from the play. Eventually they dropped that and it just became Heidelberg. They were, where Rainier tended to go into sports events and a lot of advertising and stuff around athletics and sports. Heidelberg did some of that, but Heidelberg went more to billboards, street signs. I'm old enough to remember the beautiful Heidelberg mural that was on Pacific Avenue, that was on the end of the Joy building at the University of Washington, that got obliterated by mistake. But anyway, but they had wall signs everywhere. And absolutely my favorite thing that Heidelberg did, and Rainier later on, would do advertising on radio and all that. So did Heidelberg, But my favorite thing that Heidelberg did, and they did it starting in the 1950s, and they did it all the way up into the 1970s, is they went around and they had crews of sign painters, and they would find barns on the rural roads in the state, and they would pay the farmer to be able to paint a Heidelberg on their barns. Wow. Sometimes they painted on the roof, sometimes what happened was, I was involved with the state. Washington State is admired. We have one of the few state programs to preserve our barns. We have a heritage barn program that a lot of states are envious of, but we spend money giving money to farmers to keep their barns standing, even though they have equipment rather than livestock now.
Sure.
Heidelberg had a barn preservation program that was killer because the farmer kept their barns up, even though they may not have livestock, but they kept the barn up because they got paid by Heidelberg to have the sign on the barn. And I know that later on some of the the programs during the LBJ years to get rid of signage on our state highways made it harder and harder. It kind of made it hard to put it on the federal highways, but on the state and the county routes, Heidelberg went from putting signs on barns on the interstates to going to the state routes because they could still do the wall, still do the paintings. And it meant that the farmers kept their barns going. And occasionally somebody will peel vinyl siding off an old wood barn and bingo, that'll be the old Heidelberg sign.
God, I can't imagine that.
Question.
Yeah.
So Pacific Brewing closed during Prohibition when Antone Huth's son took over, so they didn't make it. What happened to Puget Sound Brewing, which was one of the biggest in Tacoma, right?
Well, they were absorbed before Prohibition, they were absorbed into Pacific Brewing. There were two breweries down there that both were at the peak days. Eventually, Antone Huth ended up buying both of them. The other one was up at Jefferson and 25th, and I've drawn a blank on the name. I want to, might have been Pioneer Brewing, I can't remember, but it was one of the really early ones. It started in 1884, 3, and then eventually it got absorbed.
So
but
Columbia,
that's what happened to Puget Sound and the other one both absorbed into Pacific.
And then shut down.
Was that the Donahue? Or was that before that?
Maybe it was Donahue. Yes, I think that was it. Yep.
Good job, Ron.
Yes.
Points for Ron.
Good. Get a star.
That's all he wanted to hear you say.
Well, we're kind of, we get here to the story where you really have the competition going on locally between the big breweries, and eventually you're starting to have on a national level, you're starting to have, Budweiser and Coors and these big guys. Some of the Miller Company are starting to buy regional breweries and further standardizing the recipes and the type of beer that's made. And they tended to come in and make an investment in a brewery and then build their holdings till they had enough where they could take control and just buy out the other owners. So that was the pattern. So
still is.
Yeah. And eventually Carling came in and would buy, Carling had a US branch. They came in, they bought Rainier in Seattle, and then shortly thereafter they bought Heidelberg. And then they didn't need both breweries, and that was the decision was made that then they would close Heidelberg. So I want to say, this before I came to Tacoma, but I want to say it's like 79 maybe that Heidelberg stopped making beer. And then Rainier held on, but now I don't think, isn't Rainier made somewhere states away? I mean, it's not even local anymore. So the big, and then Olympia, would eventually close too. So those mass-produced big production beers that were regional pretty well by 1980s were pretty much a thing of the past. And it really starts to be the reason why I think a lot of the craft brewing starts to fill the void, because you're starting to have, first of all, that everybody was numbed by how bland the beer was.
Boring market.
People were starting to look at higher premium quality, and you're starting to have, not sure this is recent history, but I know, was it Bud Grant over in Yakima started making beer pretty early. I want to say that's like late 80s, maybe even not late 80s.
Yep. Very, very early.
And Red Oak.
Yep.
Do you have any insight on why Rainier was chosen between the two, Rainier and Heidelberg? Any idea why that, with Heidelberg being so big and being so popular at the time. And it's crazy to think that Rainier was like the winner between those two.
Yeah, I think partly it was closer to Seattle and the big market. Rainier had been really chummy with sports, and by then we'd gone baseball. Sick built Sick Stadium, and then he had the Pilots, and then they got bought, and then they built Kingdom, hoping to get a baseball team. So that was all kind of in play, getting a football team, all that kind of stuff going. Also, by the time that the big brewers were coming in, nobody was working by train anymore. Everything was by surface truck delivery and everything. And Heidelberg was great in terms of access to train, but it wasn't easy access onto I-5 and for trucks and stuff. So I don't know if that's entirely it, but I think that was part of it. I suspect there was probably some just ownership preference as far as territory goes, that they just
just developing metropolitan area makes total sense.
The Sick was very much involved in a revival over the ongoing struggle between Seattle and Tacoma over the name of the mountain. So we literally almost went to war, chambers of commerce and newspapers over the mountain's name and the Northern Pacific Railroad, the mountain's name is Tacoma. It's Tacoma. But in Seattle, it's Rainier. And so Sick was a partisan in that race. So not only does he name his beer Rainier, but then he names the baseball team Rainiers too, the first version of it. And, to some degree, that was like, in your face kind of.
Sure.
So I think there was a little bit of territorial kind of regional stuff going on there too.
Rich guys never do that kind of stuff though. I hope everybody drinks your Heidelberg this week.
Yes. All right, Grit and Grainers, email us at shares@gritgrainpodcast.com with your comments, opinions, and proof that in 1936, after Columbia Breweries in Tacoma was the first Pacific North brewery to introduce canned beer, which was called the Alt Heidelberg Guest Beer, the same year as the Tacoma Philharmonic was formed, it was the first empty beer can to roll down a theater aisle in our region during a performance. We read and drink everything we receive, and we try to respond as quickly as we can, not online, then on air. You can subscribe to Grit and Grain on Apple Music, Spotify, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and Stitcher, and please leave us a review. Also check us out on Channel 253 Douglas and gritgrainpodcast.com. Be sure to also follow us on Facebook and Instagram for signs that it's cool to bust out and grin wildly and start joyfully high-kicking and blissfully screaming your way through life like it's your own personal roll-licking tilt-a-whirl. But everyone knows you'll never make it very far as a triangle with one 253-degree angle, one negative 72-degree angle, and one bad attitude. If this podcast is not what you expected, please alter expectations. In addition to Father John Misty songs, broccoli rubber bands, and T-shirts from 1898, Hipster Dads love revamped Heidelberg Premium Lager brewed by Seven Seas Brewery. No such thing as a bad time to visit Tacoma. No such thing as too much barley wine. Tune in next Friday for more sweet chatter. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to follow us at Grit and Grain Podcast wherever you get your social media and catch new episodes every Friday. Cheers.
Good up.
Channel 253 is a member-supported podcast network. I'm producer Doug Mackey, and I'm asking you to become a member and show your support. Go to channel253.com/membership to join. Thank you. Grit and Grain is part of the Channel 253 podcast network. Check out our other shows: Nerd Farmer, Interchangeable White Ladies, Move to Tacoma, Crossing Division, Citizen Tacoma, What Say You, We Are Tacoma, Flounders B Team, and Taco Man.
This is Channel 253.